chosen one. Stop. For the next few minutes, don't rush. Don't scroll to the next video. Don't answer that message. Don't let your mind run 10 steps ahead of where you are right now. Just sit down. Because there are moments in life when the most important thing you can do is not move, not chase, not explain, not force, not panic. Just become still long enough to hear what you have been too distracted to recognize. And perhaps that is why these words found you at this particular moment. Sit down. You need to hear this before it happens. Before what happens? That is the question. And I am not going to give you a vague answer and leave you with empty promises. I want you to stay with this message because there is a reason the word before matters. Before the change, before the decision, before the door opens, before the answer arrives, before something that has been quietly developing finally becomes visible. There is usually a moment when you are given the opportunity to see things differently, and that moment often comes before the evidence, before everyone else notices, before you can prove anything, before you can point to something and say, "See, I knew it." That is where many people become frustrated. They want proof first. They want the result first. They want the confirmation first. But faith often asks you to become still before you understand why you need to be still. And maybe you've been feeling that tension lately. Maybe you have been trying to figure out why your mind feels so busy, why you keep thinking about the same situation, why you feel like something is changing even though you cannot explain exactly what it is, why certain things that used to excite you suddenly don't feel the same, why you are becoming less interested in proving yourself to people, why you're questioning where you're going, why you're looking at your own life and thinking, something has to change. If any of that feels familiar, don't dismiss it immediately. You don't have to call every feeling a supernatural sign. You don't have to pretend you know exactly what the future holds, but you can pause. You can listen. You can examine what is happening inside you. Because sometimes the first indication that a chapter is changing is not that something outside you suddenly explodes into your life. Sometimes it is that you stop being satisfied with the version of life you were previously tolerating. And that distinction matters. Because you may have been asking, "God, when is something finally going to happen?" While the deeper question may actually be, "What is happening inside me while I wait?" That is where this message begins, not with a prediction, with a pause. Because the person who keeps running may miss what the person who becomes still can finally see. Think about how often you have rushed through your own life. You woke up thinking about what needs to be fixed. You went to sleep thinking about what still isn't fixed. You answered people. You handled responsibilities. You worried about money. You thought about relationships. You replayed conversations. You imagined different outcomes. You wondered whether something would ever change. And somewhere in all that noise, you may have forgotten to ask yourself one simple question. What if I don't need to chase the answer right now? What if you need to understand the season you're already in? What if the delay isn't asking you to run faster? What if it is teaching you how to recognize something you would have overlooked before? Stay with me because this is where the message gets deeper. The phrase "before it happens" creates an important distinction. It means this message isn't primarily about what has already happened. It is about preparation, not preparation through panic, preparation through awareness. There is a difference. Panic says, "Something is coming. I need to control it." Awareness says, "Something may be changing. I need to pay attention." That difference can completely change how you walk through uncertainty. And perhaps the most important thing you need to hear right now is this. You do not have to know the entire future to make a wise next move. You only need enough clarity for the next step. Sometimes we become exhausted because we demand a 10-year answer from a one-day situation. We want to know how everything will end, who will stay, who will leave, where the opportunity will come from, when the breakthrough will happen, what the next chapter will look like. But life rarely gives you the entire map. You are given moments, choices, lessons, patterns, warnings, opportunities to grow. And sometimes a quiet realization that says, "This isn't working anymore." That realization can be painful, but it can also be the beginning of clarity. So before we go any further, I want you to think about something. Not a person, not a problem, not a wish. Think about the one area of your life where you have been trying the hardest to force an answer, the thing you keep checking, the thing you keep overthinking, the thing you keep asking. When? Now ask yourself something different. What would change if I stopped forcing this for a moment and simply listened? If that question hits somewhere deep, you don't need to explain your whole story. Just write, I'm slowing down. Not because you have given up, because you are learning to stop confusing movement with progress. And there is a reason I want you to understand that before we continue, because what comes next is not about waiting forever. It is about recognizing the difference between a closed door and a door that requires you to become ready before you walk through it. And once you understand that difference, you may look at your past very differently, because some of the things you called delays may have been doing something you couldn't see at the time. And that brings us to the part most people don't want to talk about. The season before the change. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from waiting for something you cannot control. You can work harder, you can plan better, you can improve yourself, you can make better decisions, but eventually there are things you cannot force. And that is where the waiting becomes personal. You start asking questions that go beyond the situation. Why me? Why now? Why does everyone else seem to be moving forward? Why am I still here? And perhaps the most painful question, did I miss my moment? If you've ever asked yourself that, understand this. A delay is not automatically a denial, and being unable to see movement does not automatically mean nothing is happening. Sometimes life is changing in ways that don't produce immediate visible results. Think about a seed beneath the ground. From the surface, it looks like nothing is happening. Days pass. The ground looks exactly the same. Someone looking only at the surface might say, nothing is growing. But the absence of visible growth is not necessarily the absence of development. Now, that doesn't mean every delay has some guaranteed divine explanation. Sometimes life is simply complicated. Sometimes people make poor decisions. Sometimes circumstances are unfair. Sometimes we need to take responsibility for what we can control. But faith gives you another possibility to consider. Perhaps this season is not only about getting somewhere. Perhaps it is also about becoming someone who can handle where you are going. Because imagine receiving something you desperately wanted while still carrying every fear that existed before it. Would the external change automatically create internal peace? Not necessarily. You could get the opportunity and still feel unworthy. You could enter the relationship and still expect abandonment. You could receive success and still believe it could disappear tomorrow. You could finally reach the destination and discover that your mind never learned how to rest. That is why preparation can happen quietly. And sometimes the hardest preparation is not learning how to receive. It is learning how to stop chasing. You've probably noticed that some of your old reactions don't feel natural anymore. Maybe you used to respond immediately. Now you pause. Maybe you used to explain yourself to everyone. Now you don't feel the same need. Maybe you used to chase people who were distant. Now something inside you says, let them go. Maybe you used to panic when plans changed. Now you're beginning to understand that not every change is a disaster. These shifts can feel strange because when you change internally, your old life may begin to feel unfamiliar before your new life becomes visible. That is an uncomfortable place. You are no longer who you were, but you don't yet know exactly who you're becoming. And that middle ground can feel like emptiness, but perhaps it isn't emptiness. Perhaps it is transition. Now here's the part I want you to pay close attention to. The title doesn't say, run. It says, sit down. Why? Because your next answer may not require more noise. It may require discernment. There are decisions you should not make while terrified. There are conversations you should not have while emotionally overwhelmed. There are doors you should not force simply because you are tired of waiting outside. And there are moments when your greatest act of strength is refusing to let urgency make your decisions for you. Urgency can be useful, but panic is not wisdom. There is a difference between saying, I need to act, and saying, I need to act right now because I'm afraid that if I don't, everything will be lost. The second one can lead you into places you never intended to go. So maybe sit down is a reminder. Don't let fear decide what faith should decide. Take a breath. Look at the facts. Look at the pattern. Look at your choices. Look at what you have learned. Ask what is actually within your control. And then ask God for wisdom about what isn't. That is a much stronger position than simply waiting for a miracle, because you are not being asked to become passive. You are being invited to become intentional. And there may be something in your life right now where this distinction matters enormously. Perhaps you are considering walking away. Perhaps you are considering beginning again. Perhaps you're waiting for a response. Perhaps you're rebuilding after disappointment. Perhaps you're standing at a crossroads and both directions feel uncertain. If so, don't rush to manufacture certainty. Sometimes clarity comes after you stop demanding it on your schedule. If this part connects with where you are right now, tell me honestly in the comments. What are you learning to stop forcing? You don't need to tell your entire story. One sentence is enough, because there is something powerful about putting into words what you are finally releasing. And there is another layer here. You may think the biggest thing happening is the thing you are waiting for, but what if the bigger thing is the person you are becoming while you wait? What if the real transformation is happening in the way you think, the way you choose, the way you respond, the boundaries you now understand, the things you no longer tolerate, the peace you are learning to protect? That matters, because when the external moment finally arrives, you want to meet it with clarity instead of desperation. And this leads to the next question. How will you know when the season is actually changing? Not through fantasy, not through forcing every coincidence into a sign, but through patterns, through clarity, through opportunities that align with what you have been preparing for, through decisions that suddenly become easier because you finally know what you cannot continue doing, through peace that does not require everything around you to be perfect, and sometimes through one very uncomfortable realization. You are ready to leave behind something you once begged to keep. That realization can feel like loss, but it can also be freedom. And that is where the shift begins. There comes a moment when waiting stops feeling like waiting. Something changes. Maybe nothing dramatic happens. No announcement. No giant sign in the sky. No instant transformation. But inside you, something becomes clear. You realize you don't want to go backward anymore. That is a shift. You may still have questions. You may still have fears. You may still have days when you doubt yourself, but something has changed. Your old patterns don't satisfy you the way they once did, and that matters more than you think, because change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins as a quiet refusal. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep abandoning myself to make other people comfortable. I can't keep chasing what doesn't choose me. I can't keep making decisions from fear. I can't keep treating every delay as proof that I'm forgotten. Those statements may not feel like breakthroughs, but they can be the beginning of one, because the moment you stop participating in a cycle, the cycle loses some of its power, and perhaps that is part of what you need to hear before it happens. Before the external change, there may need to be an internal decision, a decision that says, I will not let uncertainty control me. I will not confuse silence with rejection. I will not turn one difficult season into a permanent identity. I will not assume that because something hasn't happened yet, it never will. But there is another side to this. You also shouldn't assume that everything you want is guaranteed to happen exactly as you imagine it. That's important. Faith is not the same thing as demanding a specific outcome. Faith can mean trusting God while remaining open to the form the answer takes. Sometimes you pray for one door, and another door opens. Sometimes you ask for restoration, and instead you receive release. Sometimes you ask for a person to return, and instead you discover who you are without them. Sometimes you ask for a particular opportunity, and the delay gives you time to become capable of something much larger. This is why the words "before it happens" are so powerful, because you don't yet know exactly what it is, and that uncertainty is intentional. The curiosity gap isn't. What magical event will happen at exactly this time? The deeper question is, what am I supposed to understand before the next chapter becomes visible? That is a much more meaningful question. And perhaps your answer begins with something you've overlooked: your patterns. Pay attention to what keeps repeating, not because repetition automatically proves divine intervention, but because repeated experiences can reveal lessons you have not finished learning. The same type of conflict, the same type of relationship, the same kind of fear, the same hesitation, the same temptation to settle, the same moment where you ignore your own instincts and then wonder why you're exhausted afterward. Patterns are information, and wisdom means learning from information. Maybe this is why certain things have been bothering you more lately. You are seeing them differently. What you once accepted may now feel wrong. What you once chased may now feel empty. What you once feared losing may no longer control you. That can be one of the clearest signs of personal growth. Not that everything suddenly becomes easy, but that you become less willing to betray your own values just to keep everything comfortable. And when that happens, your future can begin to look different. Because your decisions are different, your standards are different, your attention is different, your priorities are different, and eventually your circumstances may reflect those choices. That is not magic. That is transformation. And transformation often begins before anyone else can see it. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine someone who spends years saying yes because they are afraid of disappointing people. Eventually they realize that every yes is creating resentment, so they begin saying no. At first it feels selfish, then uncomfortable, then freeing. Their circumstances haven't changed yet, but they have, and because they have changed, the kinds of relationships they maintain begin to change. The opportunities they accept begin to change. The environments they tolerate begin to change. The life they build begins to change. The external transformation follows an internal shift. That is why sitting down matters. Stillness gives you a chance to see the connection between what you believe, what you choose, and what you keep experiencing. And perhaps there is something you need to hear before your next major decision. You do not have to react to every signal. You don't need to chase every opportunity. You don't need to answer every accusation. You don't need to prove your worth to everyone. You don't need to convince someone to understand you. You don't need to force a door open simply because you are afraid there won't be another one. Sometimes the strongest response is patience. Sometimes the strongest response is preparation. Sometimes the strongest response is walking away. And sometimes the strongest response is staying, but staying differently, with boundaries, with wisdom, with self-respect, with faith. Now think about your own life. What has been asking you to become more patient? What has been teaching you boundaries? What has forced you to reconsider what you truly want? What have you survived that you once believed would destroy you? That last question matters, because if you've already survived things you thought you couldn't survive, then you have evidence that your fear has not always been a reliable predictor of your future. Fear says, "This will destroy me." Experience sometimes says, "I've been here before, and I made it through." That doesn't mean pain is meaningless. It means pain does not get to write the entire story. And perhaps the chapter you're entering requires you to stop identifying yourself by what happened to you. You are allowed to learn from the past without living inside it. You are allowed to remember without returning. You are allowed to forgive without reopening the door. You are allowed to move forward without having every question answered. And if there is one thing I want you to carry into the final part of this message, it is this. Don't become so obsessed with what is about to happen that you miss what is happening inside you right now. Because the next chapter does not begin when everything outside becomes perfect. It can begin with one decision, one boundary, one act of courage, one honest prayer, one moment of stillness, one realization that says, "I don't want to keep living from fear." And once you make that decision, the title begins to make sense in a completely different way. Sit down. Not because you should stop living, but because you need to stop running long enough to recognize where you are going. And now we come to the part that ties everything together, because there is one thing you may have been waiting for without realizing that it was already beginning.